Hi, welcome to today's CyberThreat Report. Today is September 1st, 2011. Joining us today, we have Jim Clogging. Jim is a malware expert, malware analysis expert, I should say. He's also our connection to the malware analysis community. Welcome, Jim, and looks like you have a few items to discuss with us today. Is that right?
Yeah, a couple of things I wanted to talk about. A quick follow-up to something we talked about last week about Apache, and then I wanted to talk about some of the issues with one of the SSL certificate authorities that's been in the news this week. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the password brute forcing attempts that we're seeing in some of our honeypots that we had mentioned in passing in previous shows.
All right, great. I look forward to it. We also have Nancy Grover. Nancy is a senior member of our cybersecurity team. Welcome, Nancy. What will you be talking about today?
Today I'm going to talk about well, it's not super new, but out within the last few months. It's a list that the NSA put together on protecting home networks. So I'm going to just go over just a few of the points on the list. It's pretty long and comprehensive.
Good. That should be interesting. And we also have Chaim Spielman. Chaim is a enterprise security analyst. Thank you for joining the team here, Chaim. Could you give us since you're sort of new to this program here, can you give us just a quick introduction and what do you expect to talk about today?
I'm Chaim Spielman. I work as a enterprise analyst for AT&T security and for commercial and government contracts. Today I would like to talk a little bit about a recent news item which involved companies hiring people who actually hack their systems and have some discussion around whether we think it's a good thing to do, the pros and cons of hiring. We're talking about people who have taken criminal action and attacked companies, and then the companies going and hiring.
That should be an interesting discussion. Thanks, Chaim. And I'm Brian Rexroad. I'll cover the Internet Weather Report today, and I think we have a couple of very interesting observations to share with you today. Some on the good news side, which is a nice change. So let's go ahead and move ahead here. Jim, what is the update on the Apache range header exploit?
Yeah, we talked last week about this Apache range header denial of service vulnerability. And there were a few workarounds presented last week, and just in the last 2 days, Apache has released a new version of their web server software that fixes the problem. I believe the way they decided to go about it was they look at the size of the various ranges, and if they add up to more than the size of the entire page, they just ignore the range header and give you the whole page. But that's out in the last couple of days, so if you haven't updated your Apache web servers, you should be looking at that real soon to protect yourself from this denial of service vulnerability.
There's a item here I want to point out in the weather report a little later on that suggests maybe, and we don't have any strong evidence of it, but there is something suggestive that there may be some folks out scanning, perhaps looking for vulnerable sites. So we'll want to take care of that. So, Jim, do you have any insight into how risky that patch might be, relatively speaking?
I haven't looked at the new release myself. I'm waiting for my home web server is a Ubuntu Linux, so I'm waiting for it to come to me through their distribution to update it. But it doesn't look like it's going to make significant changes to the previous version other than this particular fix for the range header issue. So it doesn't look like it should be too risky, but obviously before you deploy this in production, do it on a test system and test it out first.
Great. Thank you. So the next item here, Nancy, you had some insights to share with us. Is that right?
I do, and this is again about the NSA report that they put out in April, and it talks about things that the average user can do on their home network because most people seem to think that attackers are only going to go after a company, big corporation, something like that, but, there's a lot of easy pickings out there in the user community, and so they've been a lot of times targeting those networks instead. So anyway, I'm just going to touch on a few items on this list because, again, it's pretty long. The first group of items are really for Windows-based networks when you're using a Windows operating system. One of the most important things you could do, of course, is to update your operating system from, say, XP. I got to admit I was a holdout on that one. I didn't want to go to Vista, but I did go to Windows 7. I think it's excellent. The security features are great, especially if you run it as 64-bit. If you run it as 64-bit, it makes it even more difficult for attackers. So that's, again, one of the most important things I think you can do is to upgrade your OS. Also, limit the use of the administrator account. You don't need to do every single thing on your computer as an administrator, and when you do that, you're kind of opening the door, again, for attackers. What's really nice about Vista and Windows 7 is that you can run a lot of applications as administrator without actually logging in as administrator, and so if you feel, if you need to use the administrator account, then use it that way instead.
Nancy, before we move on that, I just wanted to make a quick comment. That particular topic about use of the administrator account, this notion of having an administrator account has sort of moved into the Windows environment around the NT timeframe. But that has always been a sort of a pet peeve of mine that a lot of applications actually would break when trying to run it as a common user as opposed to administrator. So I think one of the really powerful things that's happening now is that that whole environment has improved significantly, and I think it's great advice.
Right, definitely. And then, like in the Unix world and, say, a big data center, we're always taught to not run everything as administrator. So I'm glad, like you said, that, the home OS makers are starting to take notice of that. Mm-hmm. Another item that is maybe a little more advanced, and that's to use a PDF reader with sandboxing capabilities or even a web browser with sandboxing capabilities. That will kind of contain malware and that sort of thing. But going back again to the OS and updating it, it's just as important to keep your applications up to date, especially the Microsoft applications like 2007. Go to 2007 or later. 2010 is even better. And that's just the way that the software is handling the documents and that sort of thing, making them less apt to, well, basically what you can't do is run malicious code off of them any longer like you might have done with previous versions of Microsoft Office. And also, I think I just kind of mentioned keeping application software up to date. And if at all possible, implement some sort of full disk encryption. That would be on your laptop specifically, so if you're traveling with your laptop and you lost it, someone who found it couldn't get into all of your personal and private files. That's what they have.
I'm sorry, Nancy, for interrupting, but on the full disk...
I'm glad you are.
On the full disk encryption, it's probably, I thought it would be important to point out that full disk encryption really only works when the machine is turned off. And so if the machine is turned on, basically the decryption is activated. So I think it's another good piece of advice that is certainly if you have the full disk encryption and you're traveling with a laptop, you need to at least put it into hibernate. Sleep is still an active mode. When you open the lid on your laptop, it's basically going to nullify that disk encryption. So it's important to make sure the machine's turned off or at least hibernated.
That's a really, really excellent point.
The recommendation for personal computers as well?
If there's a risk for, if you're concerned about a break-in, that certainly would be helpful. Again, the same kind of situation applies here, that is you need to make sure the machine is turned off because what happens is the decryption becomes resident in the machine and or the keys associated with the decryption are resident in the machine in the memory. It is possible to extract that if a hacker is sophisticated enough, or the attacker is. Certainly, if they're breaking into a home, you might want to be concerned about that, or obviously the same kind of situation would apply in an office.
Yeah, and fortunately, with the current the most modern versions of the full disk encryption software, if you're running it on any kind of reasonably new platform, you're not going to suffer much of a performance hit either. It's 5%-ish range. And so unless you're running it on really old software or really old hardware or with really limited memory, you're not going to really notice it most of the time.
I've been running it. In fact, I think we probably all are running it on our computers, and I haven't seen all that. I have to admit, I was very reluctant to accept it, but having been using it for a couple of years now, it's been very minimal interference.
You're right.
Yep, it mostly affects you at boot time, and once it's up and running, it's minimal impact. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even the startup is very minimal. A lot of people are worried about that. So for Apple-based networks or computers, I should say, it's also, we got the same, the first 3 points are pretty much the same as in a Windows environment. Maintain your OS, keep it up to date, keep your third-party applications up to date, and also limit the use of the administrator account, though in Apple land that's known as the privileged account. And then one thing the NSA does point out that's a little different here is about the iPad, even though we talked about laptops in a Windows environment. And it's really important with the iPad as well. I'm going to throw in smartphones here, too, to enable, the password on those things, if you can, a PIN, up to 6 digits, if your device is capable of it, 4 if it's not. But it's so, so, so important to do that. What's nice with the iPad is that when you do set that PIN, it even adds a little bit more of a I guess I'm going to call it a pseudo encryption, because I don't believe it's a full encryption like the encryption we were just talking about with laptops. But it does include something, and I think that's great. And also, again, if you're a Mac user, you can consider using the File Vault, which will save your files in an encrypted manner. So the NSA, they were pretty comprehensive on this list, and they're even going into home networks as well, talking about home network design and all of that sort of thing. And I'm not going to go over each of these things, but let's talk about the WPA2 on wireless networks. Most people know now that they should secure their wireless network using some sort of a key. And a lot of people, sadly, are still using WEP or WEP encryption, and that can be broken in a matter of minutes these days. So it's really, really important to switch that up to WPA2 if your router allows it, and if it doesn't, then you should probably go buy a new router.
Nancy, I think we may have talked about this in a previous program some time ago, but it'd be worth mentioning in this particular case. I've seen cases where some users have set up 2 wireless networks in their home, one that protects their own network, but another one that they've kind of set up as a guest network that does not have any encryption on it. And, they've set it up so that it's isolated. That is a case where I think there's also a security consideration that folks should take into account. That is, that allows somebody, a bad person, to come in, do something bad on their network, not necessarily against targeting them, but using their IP address. So I think we even had a chat prior to coming in here. One thing you definitely don't want to get into a situation with is having somebody using your network to perhaps do something to post child porn, for example. And that is obviously a very illegal and undesirable thing to have happen, and then perhaps have law enforcement come knocking on your door and asking why your network was doing that. So I recommend protecting not just your own protected network, but also putting some protection on anything that you might be using for guests. So you'd be willing to share the password with your guests, but you certainly don't want it to be open to just anybody.
Mm-hmm.
The new routers support a guest account, which is different than all the other systems in the network, so to allow you to both be secure and at the same time be able to ensure that outsiders are not able to gain access.
That's good. That's a nice feature.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the last thing I want to touch on home networks is to implement strong passwords on all your network devices. So if you've got a little firewall, if you've got a little router, if you've got some sort of network access point, don't depend on that default password that maybe your cable or carrier provided to you. Instead, change it so that it's not so easily accessible.
Absolutely. I think we have a couple of examples to elaborate on that or emphasize that point a little later on. Is that right, Jim?
Yeah.
Okay, then the last couple of slides, this one is for operational security. I believe the last two slides are about operational security. And again, this is just, we already talked about personal mobile devices and protecting those items. Think about if you're going to store personal information out in some kind of cloud service. I'm not saying anything bad about cloud services here, but if you've got something that's really, really, really personal, say Social Security numbers, which you should not be saving on your computer, but let's say you had something kind of along those lines, you don't want to put something like that in a cloud service. Keep that stored on your computer or preferably off. But think about what you're putting on those cloud services before you do. Same with social networking sites. We've talked about this over and over again. People storing personal info, putting personal information there, phone numbers and all kinds of things like that. And then, of course, you want to use SSL encryption, though you might want to consider that, too, after Jim's done talking in a little bit. It's still important to do. And then password management, and that, I know, Brian, you had something you wanted to say about that.
Well, I think this is a case where the recommendation here is to make sure that you have unique passwords for for each of the sites that you visit, and make sure that they're good passwords. And that becomes a challenge. I think the traditional advice has been don't write down your passwords. And certainly you wouldn't want to write down your password and stick it on as a sticky note on your monitor or something like that where anybody could just see it. But I think the sort of new mindset here is we actually recommend writing down your passwords, put them in a notebook, keep them in a safe place. And as a practical matter, that's what's necessary. Often, most of us probably have dozens of different accounts and different systems for different merchants and that sort of thing. As a practical matter, it's a requirement that if you want to have good password management, you're going to have to write those down.
Right, and and you can even cloak those passwords in some manner when you write them down. You can disguise a PIN as a phone number, for instance. You can disguise a password as somebody's name in your address book, something like that. Again, you can easily do that. You just got to remember which phone number you used for your PIN, I guess. But again, just cloak it if you're going to write it down in some way. And that's about all I have for this. Again, there's a lot more to the list. People should go out and take a look at it, and it's at nsa.gov called Best Practices Data Sheet.
All right, very good. Was there another question or comment on that?
Yeah, this is Chaim. I was pointing out that one of the things we've seen recently was with a user or users who were compromised, and their passwords were served up to keyboard, to the keystroke logging. And what we found was that the passwords are then reused to attempt to get into other accounts that they have. And that's why it's important to have different passwords for different accounts that you have. So even if one of them is compromised, not everything is compromised.
Absolutely. This is not a theoretical recommendation here. This is based on, I think we agree with it certainly based on practical experience where we've seen, and some of the malware that's out there, we've talked about some of them before, the SpyEye, Zeus, they're out there specifically for the purpose of grabbing user identity credentials, that is login and password information, and to try to use those in various places. Absolutely.
And I think I'm going to say just one more item, and that is with reusing a password. Again, we shouldn't reuse a password, but I think it's okay as long as the login piece of it, your user ID is different, because then your user ID combination, you can keep it unique. So if I'm going to use the password dog, which I would never do, with my primary email address, I could maybe reuse dog with a whole different login name.
A little bit of a chance there, but that is probably a reasonable thing to do. All right, very good. Thank you, Nancy. And again, that advice is available from the NSA's website, www.nsa.gov. And I was actually very encouraged by seeing some of this, what I would describe as practical guidance for your home user related to network security. Good stuff. So the next item here, Jim, what do we have next on the list?
Yeah, one of the things that has hit the news in the last couple of days, and maybe you've noticed that you've gotten a new version of Firefox and a new version of Chrome and Opera, the web browsers all coming out in the last couple of days, was there was another of the certificate authorities, in this case DigiNotar, which is a certificate authority out of the Netherlands, that was apparently compromised in early to mid-July. And apparently they were convinced to, or the bad guys created a SSL certificate for *Google.com that was then apparently distributed in Iran, that allowed the attackers to perform a man-in-the-middle attack to basically steal traffic destined for Google websites, and to then potentially steal passwords, steal their Gmail accounts and that kind of thing. This is not the first time we've seen a certificate authority that had issues. A few months ago, it was Komodo. A few years ago, VeriSign was convinced to give a fraudulent certificate for Microsoft.com. But it brings up an issue that actually I think Patrick talked about a couple of weeks ago briefly, a talk that Moxie Marlinspike gave at Black Hat, that there are some potential issues in the whole way that we've set up the SSL and the certificate authorities. Basically, there are 650 root CAs, root certificate authorities, that can give out certificates. You can buy certificates for your website from them. And in a lot of cases, we're not so sure how secure they are, and once you trust them, you basically end up having to trust them forever. So anyway, the DigiNotar word started getting around a few days ago, maybe the end of last week, that they had offered up some fraudulent certificates, and they revoked some of them. But in the case of, in this case, it seems to have been significant enough that a lot of the major browsers, Chrome, Firefox, Opera, and Microsoft, have all removed DigiNotar's root certificate from their trust list. So basically, they're trying to say, don't trust anything that came out of these guys.
Well, I have a question about this, Jim. I was, I've been reading about this, and yeah, we did talk about another digital certificate or digital authority having this happen to them, where they actually had to shut down for a while to regroup. But so they've got this digital certificate, and in this particular case, it's got a certificate for .google.com. So is the user required or tricked into downloading some sort of malware, say by visiting a site or something, that allows the attacker to redirect the request before it hits the actual Google server?
That is one way that this could be used, absolutely.
Right.
And I think that's probably how it got used in Iran.
Yeah, there are a few things that can happen here. One is the malware could be existent on the computer. Another one would be just some sort of a weakness or a compromise in the DNS infrastructure that's serving up the domain names. There's this notion of cache poisoning attacks that can occur that can poison the DNS infrastructure. Combine this vulnerability or this exploit, so to speak, with a vulnerability in DNS infrastructure, and there is the possibility that somebody could be redirected to another site and have it appear as if it's a valid site.
Right, at least long enough for them to steal the credentials and then pass the connection onto the real site.
So the good news here is that there have been revocations put in place, and that there's so the trust is effectively removed from valid browsers. But one thing that is still a concern in my mind with respect to these cases is that a scenario where, for example, and this is not all that hypothetical of a scenario. In fact, it's sort of a real kind of situation. Say a piece of malware gets into an enterprise and perhaps uses SSL as its outbound connection to set up a command and control structure, perhaps to support data theft. And it would be connecting to an external web server that is owned by the attacker, that is controlled by the attacker. It could be a hacked website, or it could be actually a legitimate one. This is a case where they can put in a certificate that, in looking at the logs that are available at an enterprise gateway, it would appear as if this is a perfectly valid certificate. So this is an area where I think it's very important to not just be considering the validation in the browser itself, but it's very important to make sure that proxy interfaces or at the gateways of your enterprise are also checking those certificates, not just that they're a valid certificate, not just that it's not self-signed, but also that it's a valid certificate and has not been revoked.
One of the things I just heard today was that the DigiNotar root CA certificate was just added to Android in 2.3. It wasn't in the base certificate store in 2.2. Now it's in 2.3, and now we've got to go in and get it out of there. There are some websites that tell you how to do that. I haven't seen anything automatic coming out of Google yet, but I assume that there will be something soon.
Timing is everything, isn't it? Oh, yeah. Thank you, Jim. This is another good topic in the sense that it's not just the event itself, but I think some good underlying thought that needs to be put into how to deal with events like this. So what else do you have here today?
Yeah, well, the other thing I wanted to talk about, we mentioned on previous shows the password guessing attacks that we're seeing, the telnet scanning, the SSH scanning. And so a little over a month ago, on one of my honeypots that sits out on the internet, I put up an SSH honeypot to try to collect the usernames and passwords that the folks were trying to guess. And there's a lot of interesting information there that I haven't worked my way entirely through. But there are a couple of interesting things that I did discover. The honeypot's been running for a little over a month, and it's collected almost 20,000 username password guess attempts, about 10,000 unique ones. So it's seen lots of, root 1, 2, 3 or whatever. But about 10,000 unique ones. And of those, what I've got up here on the screen is the top, I think this is 20 or 25 passwords that were guessed. Out of those 10,000, Out of those, almost 20,000 actually, 402 cases of guessing the password 1234566. 160 times they guessed password. 159 times they guessed QWERTY.
You know what? This list is probably almost the same as a list they might have collected 10 years ago.
Yep. They're trying the real easy stuff, and what's frightening is these wouldn't even be on here if they weren't having success with them. So, yeah, I just wanted to throw a few of the most common ones up here just so folks could get a look at them. But I went through and I did a little bit of analysis on there. The standard complexity criteria that we recommend is, one uppercase, one lowercase, one digit, one special character, and at least 8 characters long. So I went through this list and I took a look at how many of these passwords in the list matched those criteria. It turns out that 128 of them actually did meet the criteria. They were at least 8 characters long, included upper and lower case, digit, and special character. And in fact, I've got a slide here that shows some of them that we saw. And again, it's not anything particularly, that they did any. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Jim. I was going to just, I couldn't help myself but to suggest that we add a new rule that says no password shall start with the letter P.
Well, it's the variations on the word password using the leet speak type substitutions, an @ sign for an A, a 5 or a $sign for an S, a 0 for an O, maybe adding a digit on the end, and that's what most of this particular selection, these all meet the criteria. These aren't particularly strong passwords.
That in the middle is amazing that it picked it up, and it seems somewhat common, that being the PQDV one, that super long one.
Yeah, and that just happened to fall alphabetically right in this list. So yeah, there are 2 of them here that aren't variations on the password, but and there are some in the list that are really strange, kind of like this PQD. I'm not sure where this one came from, but I didn't want to put too many of those on here for fear of giving away information to the bad guys that were seeing these. On the other hand, anybody who's watching their logs for bad login attempts could potentially find these. But the folks that are doing the scanning, in a lot of cases, they're using simple substitutions on simple dictionary words. I wanted to just share a little bit of what we found. I was kind of surprised that it was only 128 out of 10,000 that matched the standard complexity criteria that we normally see recommended. On the other hand, it does seem to work. So,
Jim, have you done any analysis on the user IDs that are targeted?
No, I haven't done a lot. I've got all of the user IDs that they've targeted in this particular, SSH scanning for the last month. I haven't looked at them a whole lot, other than most of the time they're looking for either root or administrator, or some of the standard accounts that are known to exist on a lot of servers. They'll look like for Oracle, for the database, or MySQL, or that kind of thing. I haven't looked at a whole lot more than that.
Right.
It's probably something worth taking.
My experience with SSH, when I had that open on the internet on one of my servers, I found that exactly that changing the administrator account name was very helpful in getting them to not even come anywhere near close to my administrator.
One of the things that I've done with my home server is I just don't allow password authentication. You've got to have the certificate, the private key, public key to authenticate, and you can still collect a lot of these password guessing attempts, but they can't ever get in, even if they manage to find the right password.
Well, good. Thank you, Jim. Next item here, Chaim, I guess you had some things you'd like to discuss. Is that right?
Right. I wanted to discuss the recent events where some companies are hiring known hackers who've been involved in criminal activity against their companies. In particular, recently the Austrian blogger / developer Florian Roek was hired by Google. He was involved in the Google Plus games attack, where he figured out what Google had in mind, and uncovered a lot of pre-launch activity. And later, he stole their thunder, and so that was an embarrassment for Google. They've since hired him. Similarly, Apple hired the iOS hacker Nicholas Allegra. He was involved in jailbreaking of the iPhone. And Facebook hired GeoHot, who's a hacker who cracked PS3 machines. So all of these are recent examples of companies hiring known hackers. And wanted to take a couple of minutes and share with you what some of the pluses and the minuses are of doing this, and ask the team what they think about it. Pluses for hiring hackers is it allows people who have shown experience, they know exactly, they have the mindset of breaking into systems, so now we want to use them to help us protect against others who try to attack and get into the system. And that's a little bit different than even just having people who are trained in security and whatnot, because it's you're hiring people who have actually done it and who may think a little bit differently and out of the box compared to some of the other people. The negative of that is that it encourages people to take up criminal activity so that they get famous, so that then later they're going to get hired by the same corporations. So one idea that I would have is that if you are looking for people who show talent and expertise, perhaps you should open up some kind of a window where you say, okay, anybody who would like, here's what you could do. You could go after these systems, send us your information, and if we like what you find, we'll give you a job, as opposed to doing this via the criminal and then hiring them method.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think the more controlled type of environment, I think having a good standard of business ethics or just personal ethics, I think, is an important aspect of what you look for in an employee. And quite frankly, I think the only way, personally, I would consider a candidate that has done activities like this as a reasonable candidate for hire would be one that's willing to have us garnish their wages until they've paid off the damages that they've caused in the course of doing their hacking activities.
Well, these companies that are hiring hackers, so if they would have been as open to hiring them had they been attacking, it seems like they're only, in the cases you're talking about, they're only hiring the ones that were attacking them specifically or their product specifically. I wonder if they'd been just as open to somebody who had been attacking something else or someone else, and why they thought it was okay that just because they were already attacking their stuff that it was then okay to hire them. I guess they feel like they know all the vulnerabilities and they can find them easier for them. I don't know.
Well, they certainly have shown their experience and their capabilities, and I think that's that's really an important aspect, I think, in the hiring process, is to look for not just what they say they can do, but look for clear and identifiable, tangible evidence that they actually have done some things. That sometimes you find somebody that has skills, but they're not motivated. Sometimes you find somebody who's really motivated, but they don't have the skills. It takes the combination of the two to make a very good candidate. But as I said, I think the ethics aspect of it is an important part of it as well.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing for me is, these guys have shown that they're willing to violate the law to do this. So then we get them on the inside. Now, are they going to suddenly start obeying the law all the time, or do we have to worry about, insider attacks, which are often the most damaging anyway?
It's a tough thing because you want to say, well, if the person did pay their dues to society, but you want to say, okay, they paid their dues, and now I'm going to look at them with fresh eyes. I'm not going to consider that because they've been punished. But sometimes maybe it's a little hard to look past that. I don't know.
There might also be the convenience of just getting these people off. If they're going to do this for version after version of that, they'll just get them out of the way. They'll put them on the payroll, and it's not a good way of doing things, but it might be how they want to deal with it.
Right.
Yeah. It's like a subtle form of extortion, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, I just hope they don't have friends that they can say, I can hook you up with a job. So, start attacking this and we'll get you a job.
So this is, I would very much welcome some feedback from others on their opinions on this topic. I didn't mention it earlier in the program, but certainly if you do have feedback or questions, please contact us at cyberthreat@list.att.com. Very interesting topic, Chaim, and I wish we could debate this much further, and perhaps we should bring it up again some other time. Moving on here, I'd like to share a little bit about some of the observations we've seen on the Internet over the last week or so here. And just looking at sort of our summary report, we have a few things. You see here that near the top of the list here we have Protocol 50. Protocol 50 is actually, I think that's a encapsulation protocol, and that turns out that it's probably not a significant issue, so I'm not going to report on that in any depth here. The next one we have talked about a number of times. It's port 23. We'll take a look at the activity there, the scanning on port 23. There is a little bit of activity on a P2P protocol here that I'm not going to dig into, but there is a new one. We may have reported on this one previously, but I want to highlight the recent activity here. It's on port 5038. We've seen a couple of events related to DNS. Port 53, this is on TCP port 53, as well as what appears to be correlated activity on port 53 UDP. So we'll take a look at that. A new development actually related to the activity we had been reporting in previous weeks on 3389 TCP, and also a couple of little things. One is just a little bit of a, what I would say a cautionary event on port 80. Jim had talked a little bit about the Apache exploit that now has Apache associated with it, but we're seeing an increase in the number of sources that are scanning on port 80. So we'll take a look at to what extent that's taking place. And last but not least, there is continuing activity looking for these proxies on port 8909. So let's dig into these really briefly. As we have been reporting for some time now, we've seen the scanning activity on port 23 TCP and port 22 TCP. That's related directly to the password guessing topic that Jim was sharing with us earlier. And as you can see here, what we reported around a week ago was that, we're continuously seeing this downward trend. That's a very good sign. If you recall, or if you hadn't seen previously, a lot of these sources that we've seen, and we're looking over the last 60 days here, but a lot of the sources that we've seen that attributed to this growth were actually on network in Korea. So most of this new activity was not U.S. based. It looks like they're getting that problem corrected in Korea. We saw a little increase in activity over the last weeks here, but it's also, again, diminishing again. So that's good news. So we're continuing to see sort of a downward trend. I like to see that type of thing rather than what we had seen about a month and a half ago where there was a significant increase in activity here. So good trend there. Second one here is port 5038 TCP. I didn't know what this port was for until I looked it up, but apparently we have seen some of this activity sometime in the past, several months ago. This port happens to be associated with a management activity or management capability on Asterisk voice over IP management. So this is Asterisk is an open source voice over IP software platform. I think it's actually used on some commercial hardware platforms. And it turns out that we're seeing some spikes in scanning activity on this port. It's what I would describe as somewhat aggressive, but there aren't a lot of addresses doing it. In fact, in our detection, we picked up exactly a single source address that's doing that scanning. Happens to be resident on a cloud services provider in France. So, but it is something that certainly, if you're running a VoIP-enabled PBX, if it's using this Asterisk software, you want to probably pay attention, make sure that that interface is well protected.
There have been vulnerabilities in Asterisk over the years, and it's interesting. I hadn't looked at this particular slide before now, but on my home system, I have been, in the last week, I've gotten a few snort alerts for probes looking explicitly for Asterisk. I don't think it's coming from this particular provider or on this port, but there are folks who look for that particular VoIP platform out there connected to the internet.
Absolutely. There are certainly organizations or groups that are interested in hacking into VoIP-enabled PBXs. Our fraud group is, that's their full-time job, is basically looking for these cases where PBXs get hacked into and basically making sure that, and invariably what happens is they get used for making lots of international calls and sometimes some other sorts of social network engineering scams as well. So it's important to protect those PBXs just as well as any other data processing platform. Next one is we're seeing scanning activity on port 53 TCP. It looks like there is possibly some correlated activity on port 53 UDP. So what we're looking at here on this graph is basically a relative change to what we're seeing normally on port 53. The blue line here is port 53 TCP, so that you can see there's obviously some abrupt change in activity there. That is scanning activity that we're seeing. That is probes that are taking place on the network. It is not a large number of sources doing that scanning, and this is not particularly unusual. We see phases of this here and there, and the theory here is that they're looking for DNS servers that can be used for the purpose of perhaps performing DNS amplification attacks, that is using those DNS servers to reflect attacks against targets. And it's probably a little difficult to see here, but there is some what appears to be time-correlated bumps in activity on 53 UDP as well. So this is something to sort of pay attention to. I think I tend to refer to DNS as sort of the orphan child of the internet. It's a critical part of that infrastructure, very important, something to keep a close eye on, but sometimes sits on the back burner in terms of the attention people pay to it. Next item, another good news story here. About a week ago, actually I think it was on Monday or so, a story broke. We have been reporting on this activity on port 3389 for a few weeks now. This is RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol. That's basically a protocol for getting remote access into a Windows machine. Microsoft came out with an alert. I think it originated in their blog related to a particular worm that had been discovered, the Morto worm. And it turns out that it looks like the command and control for this had been identified, and has been shut down. So whereas we saw a clear trend in upwards, the number of sources that were scanning on this particular port, it topped up around 3,500 of those that we were seeing in a given hour. That has clearly been shut down, and that is a good news story right there.
Oh, I was just going to ask you if that was your good news story you told us you were going to tell us.
One of them, yes.
Oh, that's really impressive. Very impressive.
Yeah, it's good to see cases like this where it's basically been turned off. Now, the significance of this, I think an important aspect of it to keep in mind is this particular worm, and Jim may be able to elaborate on this, but it was just going after very mundane password guesses.
It was propagating by guessing administrator passwords, and it only had a list of about 20 passwords, and they were very simple. I don't have the list in front of me right now.
That's probably the same list that you already showed us.
Well, it's a lot of the passwords on that list were in that first list I showed. Yeah, it was spreading by doing password guessing, but one of the interesting things is that the command and control was over DNS.
Oh, that is interesting. So I'd like to learn more about that.
Yeah, that may correlate a little bit to the spike and then the drop-off that we saw in the DNS.
Okay, so that's obviously, as I said earlier, an interesting and good story. This is, again, I just wanted to point this out. This is a fairly subtle increase and not a particularly unusual increase here. But what we're seeing is, and we're looking at 60 days of activity, but certainly an upward trend in the number of sources that are scanning on port 80. This is not, as I said, particularly unusual. It's especially not particularly unusual when a new vulnerability or exploit is out. That is, this is potentially, possibly associated with, in fact, maybe in some cases, legitimate security analysts sort of surveying the internet to see how many web servers might be potentially vulnerable to this particular exploit. So that is certainly one of the things that could be happening. We're going to keep an eye on this and see if it is a continuing trend. And last but not least here, I'm a little late for a meeting, so I just wanted to let my people who are waiting for me know. Next, and last but not least, we have been reporting on this a couple of weeks now. This is actually probing activity on port 8909. This is identified as being associated with a proxy application, and it continues to be very much the same. We're seeing spikes in this activity. Not hugely aggressive, in fact, a little bit less aggressive more recently than we've seen in the past. We're seeing on the order of maybe tens of millions of probes per hour, but it's off and on. And the vast majority of the probes, there are not that many addresses that are doing this probing. The ones that are very much most aggressive here are in China. So that concludes the report here. I want to thank you for joining us. And as a reminder, you can get this report from techchannel.att.com. You can get it as a podcast. Just search for the AT&T CyberThreat Report, and you can also get it from YouTube. Again, search for the AT&T CyberThreat Report. And last but not least, if you have feedback for us, questions, or if you'd like to suggest a topic for us to cover, please contact us at cyberthreat@list.att.com. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thanks, Jim, Nancy, and Chaim for joining us today. Have a good week.